Go.
And that relates to the new blue zone. I say new in quotes because we passed blue zone legislation in the House Assembly over 2 years ago. And when I was first elected to the House Assembly, I actually had a constituent of mine who had brought this issue to my attention, and I had discussions with the then Minister, Paul Davis, and about this, and I know he did as well. And shortly thereafter, we saw new legislation come before the House Assembly around blue zones, around blue zone parking, ensuring that we have the appropriate number of blue zones, ensuring that all blue zones are painted properly, and that there's permanent vertical signage in place. Because, of course, in the wintertime and so on, it's useless to have paint on the ground if it's covered in snow and you can't see it, which is why we require permanent vertical signage. And sadly, that was over 2 years ago. And since that time, there's been little to nothing done. Now, you could certainly argue that at the beginning, when it was brought to government's attention, while I'm sure it's not a new issue, and perhaps there's people in government over the years that may have been aware of the issue or so on, I would say that certainly it wasn't something that I was overly up on. I'm sure, the Minister Davis and then followed by Minister Cromwell, not something they were necessarily up on at the time. And so you could argue that there was ignorance involved, and that's why it wasn't up to par, certainly in government facilities, not to mention private facilities. But we've now, 2 years later, this issue, the legislation has been passed. The issue continues to be raised by me and by others in the House and in the media and so on, and we've still seen government fail miserably in enforcing the regulations, the new regulations, in making businesses aware of what those regulations are, to ensure they are in compliance, and even to have government-owned facilities, hospitals, schools, and so on, 2 years later, that are not in compliance with its own blue zone legislation. So now I believe we've gone beyond the point of ignorance. Now we're to a point where government is actively discriminating against persons with disabilities and in denying them appropriate access to government facilities. It is not good enough. And we have a new minister now, Minister Brazel, at Service NL, and I'm calling on Minister Brazel today to do what his predecessors failed to do, and to, number one, ensure that all government facilities are up to code in compliance with its own blue zone legislation, and number two, to get the information out to the business community so that they can also be in compliance with the new blue zone legislation. And failure for that to happen, then to get out there and then start enforcing the regulations on the private sector if they choose not to comply.
Yeah, that'd be good. Paul, it would be good. I'd love to see people actually enforce the blue zone legislation. I would also like to see, more enforcement of people who commit real crimes. And I say that knowing that it's disrespectful, and you should pay the fine if you park in a blue zone when you are not in any way carrying a permit for those who are handicapped or in any way disabled. You know what I'm saying, though? I would much rather see more enforcement out there keeping windows where they are supposed to be, as opposed to being smashed while people are grabbing fur coats. But I put this question to you. I will try and get Minister Brazel on the phone today. Before we go to my next caller, I'd like you, next time we speak, no doubt it'll be probably Friday, because that would be fun to keep the conversation going. How many blue zones parking spots are there in the city of St. John's or the province of Newfoundland and Labrador? Let's go the province versus how many permits there are for blue zone parking. That is something that I would like you to help me with, and I think our listeners would be very interested.
Well, Jonathan, so that we're not confusing the issues, okay? Mm-hmm. There are two separate issues, and I think you may be, and I stand to be correct, I think you may be confusing the issue here, okay?
Okay.
There is one issue, okay, about people who park in blue zones who do not have permits, who shouldn't be doing it, right?
Yes.
And that's an issue of fines and enforcement, and that's another issue on itself because they put a $100 fine. It should be $400, and I'll talk about it another time. This is not the issue I'm referring to. I'm not talking about people enforcing I'm not talking about someone who's parking in a blue zone illegally and getting a ticket.
I am.
What I'm talking about, okay, is that there are regulations in place okay, that say, for example, if you have a parking lot, so let's say the parking lot of motor registration, okay, it has X number of parking spaces in it, okay? It is required under the legislation to have a certain number of those parking spots to be blue zones, to be painted blue, and to have permanent signage in front of each and every spot.
Yes, I understand.
What I'm telling you is that the government, in its own facilities like motor registration, hospitals, schools, so on, are not in compliance. They don't have places for people to park with disabilities who require them. They are not in compliance with its own legislation.
Well, again, I'd like to know how many spots there are in the province, and we'll get that answer from Minister Brazel as soon as I can get him on the horn. Paul, thanks for bringing that to our attention. Drop me a line on Friday. We'll continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
You.
Bye-bye.